Good evening, Gwidi Ursula, and thank you all for coming. And welcome to all our Zoom listeners as well, our viewers. I'm going to talk to you about Richard Brydges Beechey, who is my favourite marine artist, among a great many marine artists that I admire. He was born in England, but he spent a great deal of his life here in Ireland. He lived to be a great age, and he spent roughly about half of his life here, which was, I think, around about 45 years in Ireland. Now that's it's actually a lithograph taken from the only known photograph that I've ever seen of Admiral Beechey, and I unearthed it in the bowels of the National Library in a very early illustrated newspaper that used to be printed in Dunleary, or Kingstown as it was then, called a lustrograph. And I'll show you the photograph that it's based on later on. But you can see there that he was born in 1808 and he died in 1895. Now, I'll just start off with this picture here, because this is my own favourite picture by Beechey, and it's fairly typical of his style in many, many ways. He was a great man to depict turbulent water at a time when it wasn't very popular to do so. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later on. What it shows here has a Ringsend connection. It shows a Ringsend trawler entering Kingstown Harbour. And I'll tell you, I'll go into the details of the picture afterwards, but as I said, it's my favourite painting by Beechey, and it's one of those things that if you had to run into a burning building to grab something, I think this would be it. Well, I think it could be fairly said that Beechey might have had a drop of turpentine in his veins as well as blood, because he came from a very artistic family. He joined the Royal Navy at 13 years of age, and his father, who was a famous painter, portraitist, Sir William Beechey, painted this picture of him just as he joined the Royal Navy. He was actually one of 21 children. He was the youngest of 21 children. Move on to the next one. This is Sir William Beechey, one of the most famous portrait painters of the early 19th century, end of the 18th century and well into the 19th century. But Sir William was married twice. He had 16 children by his first wife and 5 by the second. And Richard Brydges Beechey was the youngest of 21. But he was the go-to guy for portraiture. He had more or less inherited the mantle of people like Joshua Reynolds and famous artists like that. Now, his mother was also a famous artist, Phyllis Ann Jessel. She was a miniaturist. She used to paint miniature portraits, mostly on ivory and watercolours. I don't know how that exactly works, but you would wonder how she found time to be a miniaturist with 21 children to look after. Although I think, in actual fact, there was a great disparity in the ages between the youngest and the eldest. A lot of the, when the second family came along, a lot of the original family had already grown up and were married themselves. That's a fairly typical miniature portrait that she did. Princess Amelia, the daughter of King George II, died very young, apparently. But as I said, Sir William was the go-to guy. Everybody who was anybody back then got their portrait painted by Sir William Beechey. And this is, as you might guess, a portrait of Admiral. He did several portraits of Admiral Nelson. And this is said to be the best likeness of him. It was regarded by people who knew him at the time to be the best likeness of Nelson. There's a bit of a myth about him having one eye. Apparently, he didn't have one eye. He had both eyes. He simply lost the sight of one eye. There's a famous jingle that was going the rounds at the time. Some say Nelson had one eye, and others say he had one arm. You'd have to ask Lady Hamilton, whose other feature suffered harm. But a lot of the wealthy people have their children painted by Sir William Beechey. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Beechey family first, before we actually move on to Richard Brydges. It's all interconnected, but at any rate, I think he did some absolutely delightful portraits and pictures of the children of the wealthy people of the day. But I'm not too sure about the next one. I'm not altogether sure I'd like to have that one hanging on the wall, because it depicts 2 rich kids giving a poor, ragged beggar a few bob. So whatever about the intentions. Now, I just came across this one very recently, a famous Irish lady. This is a portrait done by Sir William Beechey of Sarah Curran. Now, Sarah Curran, as you know, was the sweetheart of Robert Emmet. And after Emmet was executed, she married a wealthy army officer down in Cork. And she lived for a year in Britain in 1805. And that's when this portrait was done. And her and her husband moved to Sicily. She died a couple of years after that, and her husband went on to fight in the Napoleonic Wars, and he was lost in some battle. I think it was somewhere in Spain. It's a lovely picture. But several of the Beechey family were artists, including George Duncan Beechey, who painted this portrait of the eldest son, Frederick William Beechey, who was already a captain in the Royal Navy when Richard Brydges Beechey joined it as a midshipman at 13. So that will tell you about the disparity of the ages between them. But it's a beautiful picture, I think, a wonderful image. Now, most of the naval officers of the day during this period knew how to paint and draw. It was a requirement, part of your naval training as a midshipman. But I dare say Frederick William Beechey was already an accomplished artist. And this is one of the pictures that he did of one of his expeditions into the Arctic with Franklin. I think Franklin did 4 expeditions altogether. And as far as I know, Frederick William Beechey was on 2 of them. This is one of the pictures that he painted. There was a requirement to draw headlands and things like that for recognition purposes that subsequently went onto charts, Royal Naval charts. During one of Franklin's expeditions, this island up in looking for the Northwest Passage, up in the Northwest Passage, they named this island Beechey Island. That was named in honour of Sir William. Now, there was yet another brother who was a famous artist and an Egyptologist, Henry William Beechey. He did a lot of the early exploration work in Egypt, and where he drew a lot of the hieroglyphs that were found in tombs. And he had a very responsible attitude towards Egyptology and archaeology in general at the time, because there was a lot of plundering going on by people that were termed as antiquarians back in the day. Now, he worked in conjunction with this man here, Giovanni Belzoni, or Giuseppe, I think was his name, Giovanni, an amazing character who was a circus strongman to begin with, and he became a very ardent archaeologist and an Egyptologist, along with Beechey, with Henry Beechey. And they, as I said, they had a very responsible attitude from the very early proper archaeology that was done by them. There was a great series on television about this man with Matthew Kelly starring us in all of his ventures in Egypt. Henry Beechey and his brother went on an expedition across the coast of North Africa with Frederick William Beechey, sponsored by the Royal Navy, under the auspices of the Ottoman Empire. That part of North Africa there had never been charted. It comprises the coast of Libya and part of Tunisia. And they trekked right across North Africa with a big caravan, sketching and drawing and surveying in conjunction with a seaward expedition that was going along the coast. And they actually produced charts for the first time. But on the way, en route, both Henry Beechey and Frederick William Beechey sketched all of the antiquities that were to be seen. That area was occupied and torn by the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Ottomans, so forth. So there was a lot of antiquities to be seen. That's actually the chart. The area there is generally known as the Gulf of Syrtis or Cyrenaica. And Frederick William Beechey wrote a marvellous book, a copy of which I have at home, printed in facsimile. He was a very, very good writer. He wrote everything in very, very plain, simple terms, as naval officers tend to do. And it's extremely interesting to read about all of the things that they discovered going along the coast. That's just the title page from the book that he wrote about that. That's fairly typical of the illustrations that are in the book, some of these ancient ruins. It's very, very well illustrated, particular book. Now, in 1823, Frederick William Beechey was given command of this ship here, HMS Blossom, to carry out a voyage of exploration across the Pacific and to go up into the Arctic regions to try and join up with one of Franklin's expeditions that was coming in to the northwest, trying to find the northwest passage from the eastern side. They were to try and approach it from the western side. So to that end, it was a scientific expedition as well, and there were scientists and botanists and geologists and what have you, something like what you had with Captain Cook. And even at this stage, even though Cook had been in the Pacific a good many years beforehand, there were still things to be discovered there. Now they left Plymouth and sailed down to Buenos Aires, around Cape Horn, up to Valparaiso, and they stopped off in San Francisco, which was very, very sparsely populated at the time. And then they headed across the Pacific. This is Frederick William Beechey wrote a 2-volume series of books about this voyage, and it's amazingly interesting, extremely readable. Again, they've been published in facsimile. I have copies of them at home. But en route across the Pacific, they actually discovered 6 new islands that had never been discovered before. And one of the places that they called in at was here. And this painting was done by Richard Brydges Beechey subsequently. They called it the Pitcairn Island. And this is a picture of the landing, the difficult landing at Pitcairn Island to the surf. That's the place, as you know, that when the Bounty mutineers wound up. Now, there was still one of the Bounty mutineers alive, John Adams, and Richard Brydges Beechey did a painting of him. And this is a lithograph based upon the painting. They had extensive interviews with John Adams about the mutiny, and he told them several new facts about that really weren't known before about the mutiny. He had been forgiven at this stage by the Royal Navy. They weren't the first ship to call in there. A Royal Navy vessel had been there before, and it was actually rediscovered by an American whaler just before that again. But he told them some very interesting facts, and he laid the blame for the mutiny squarely at the feet of Captain Bligh. Why wouldn't he, of course? But before they left anyway, they arranged for supplies to be sent out to him. There was an official artist on board. I can't remember his name now, but he and young Richard Brydges Beechey did a lot of sketching and painting of the type of things that they saw en route on this voyage, some of the native people and their vessels and so forth. Now, they were heading across the Pacific to a place called Lowth initially. That's present-day Okinawa. And it's a place that hadn't been visited really by very many foreigners. And they didn't get a very good reception there. And they probably would have been expelled only for the fact that there was an armed warship that the locals weren't prepared to take them on. But they got a fairly cool reception, and they sailed up the coast then of Siberia, and they went to Kamchatka. And they wound up then going into the Bering Straits and headed eastwards in the quest looking for Franklin. They had a small schooner with them that they were able to take on board the vessel. And sometimes when the ice was too heavy for HMS Blossom to penetrate, they would take the small schooner and go on ahead. But they didn't meet up with Franklin at any rate. But it was reckoned that at one stage they were within 200 miles of each other subsequently. And this is a painting that Richard Brydges Beechey did of one of those camps on the ice that the party made en route. He subsequently painted this of HMS Terror in among the icebergs. Now, this is one of Franklin's ships that was lost. The Erebus and Terror were both lost, and they've both been rediscovered recently because the ice has receded away, and they're actually found in deep water. After the first season, they had to come back, and they sailed back down the Pacific coast and overwintered in San Francisco. As I said, San Francisco was very sparsely populated, and while he was there, Richard Brydges Beechey painted some watercolors of San Francisco, and the place was known as Yerba Buena at the time. And a series of coloured lithographs were made from them when he got home. And the originals that they sold recently in America for a colossal sum. There was a Spanish outpost there, some Spanish military people in a garrison. There was a religious mission there, a Catholic mission, and some native Indians and a couple of cattle ranchers. That's all that was there. That's another one there. That's a picture of what's called the Presidio, the Spanish headquarters. It was there, the Spanish administration headquarters. Beechey didn't do very many watercolors. Now, I just want to show you this one because this is one of the few that I've ever seen. He mostly painted in oils. This is a picture of Cove. It came up for auction some years ago. Fine picture in its own right there, but he was more at home with oil painting. While they were in San Francisco in the first season, they charted San Francisco Bay. It had never been charted before. And one of the functions of the Royal Navy in peacetime was to do all this hydrographic work, make charts. And you can see all the soundings there. They actually discovered a sunken rock that wasn't known about, and it was named Blossom Rock. I don't know whether it's still there or whether it's been removed because it's right in the middle of the bay. But all subsequent charts of San Francisco were based upon that chart until relatively recently. And as I said, Beechey wrote a very fine book in 2 volumes about it, and there are a couple of other books with very, very fine coloured plates. All of them are copies of all of them are in the National Library. That was one that was written about all of the flora and fauna by Captain Beechey and some of the various scientists that were aboard the vessel. And it's a lot of the beautiful coloured plates of some things that hadn't been seen before by many Europeans. This was a purple jay, a native of that part of the world, and it was named in honour of Captain Beechey. Its Latin name today is Pica Beechey. Beautiful paintings, and there's lovely coloured plates, and these are just some more of the coloured plates from those volumes. Now they set off again on a second season. They virtually replicated the first voyage. I think they sailed straight up to Kamchatka on the second voyage, and then through the Bering Straits and into the polar regions again to try and link up with Franklin on the second season. And the ice was even heavier on the second season, so they had to abandon the thing, and they came home to sail back the same way, Valparaiso, Buenos Aires, and back to Plymouth to a great reception. And Captain Beechey subsequently published his books. Now, Richard Brydges Beechey went on then to serve in various vessels in the Royal Navy. He was at the bombardment of Algiers in the 1820s, when the Royal Navy finally pacified all the pirates after the Napoleonic Wars had finished. And he took part in several small boat actions and was mentioned in dispatches, behaving very gallantly. His brother had taken part, Frederick William Beechey had taken part in the Battle of New Orleans in a very similar type of situation. He took part in a great many small boat actions up in the bayous and in the estuary of the Mississippi and places like that. But in 1835, Richard Brydges Beechey was given command of a small paddle wheel steam vessel, and he was given the job of surveying the south and west coast of Ireland and the River Shannon. But the whole of the River Shannon is surveyed, and there are nautical charts from the period for every inch of the Shannon, from Loophead all the way up to the source. He'd been on various other vessels stationed in the Mediterranean and what have you, but he was to spend the rest of his active naval career doing this surveying work on the coast of Ireland. These are just some of the small sketches that I was telling you about that would have been done by typical naval officer sketches that would have been put on the margins of charts. You can see a lot of them on old fathom charts, black and white charts, of views of the Shannon. That's a fairly typical there, Shannon chart. I think that's Lough Derg. But while Richard Brydges Beechey was surveying Lough Ree on the Shannon, he met a young lady who lived in this house here. I won't call it a house, a castle, Portlick Castle. The owner was a reverend gentleman, and the young lady's name was Freedswide Maria Moore Smith. And Richard Brydges Beechey took a shine to her. And it said while he was courting Freedswide Maria Moore Smith that Lough Ree was the best surveyed piece of water on the planet. Freedswide, incidentally, is an English saint, the patron saint of Oxford. But that's where Portlick Castle is, on the eastern shore of Lough Ree, and it's a hotel today. But while he was surveying the west coast of Ireland, Richard Brydges Beechey was a witness to this event here, or at least he had heard about it. It was a famous shipwreck called The Intrinsic that took place just outside the harbour at Kilkee. Now, I knew about the existence of this painting because I actually dived on the spot where The Intrinsic was wrecked. And it was a very well-known shipwreck. And all hands were lost. It was a cargo of very valuable metal on board. Now, I don't know what metal it was. It could have been lead or tin or whatever. And there's reports of all of the population of Kilkee out on the cliffs helpless to do anything about the ship being wrecked. But it came up for auction recently in Italy and got a good price. I was able to get that image of it, pardon. That's Intrinsic Bay, that's portrayed in the painting there, Bishop's Rock there. And when we dived there was actually some small bits of iron on the bottom. That's about all, nothing else. That's the anchor from the Intrinsic that was taken up by local scuba divers back in the 1970s. But Beechey painted a huge amount of the vernacular working boats of the coast. And they're very, very interesting to study because he painted all of the details of vessels like that in great detail. And they're very, very interesting to study. And this is actually a Kinsale hooker down in the Blasted Sound. The Kinsale hookers were very similar to Galway hookers, except that they had a long counter stern and the rudder post came down through that instead of becoming the transom like the Galway hookers. Now, they're an extinct breed of vessel. We surveyed the wreck of one of them, the Raina there might remember, down in a creek off the river, down in near Bandon. And we tried to determine the lines of it from it. We produced a set of lines eventually, but after all that was when we found out that there was a model of one of them in the National Museum. It was an interesting exercise anyway. But that's another one there, a Kinsale hooker. And that's the Irish Lights vessel, the Princess Alexandra. Now, I think this was done late in Beechey's career, and I think he may well have been just losing his sense of perspective with this, because I think that the steamship was quite big and it looks rather small by comparison to the hooker. Nevertheless, I think that's the Skelligs. That's Eagle Island of Mayo. Another characteristic of Beechey's paintings is sometimes having a lot of wreckage floating in the foreground for dramatic effect. You can see there that he liked painting turbulent water, and he did so in a very recognisable way. If you saw Beechey painting across the street, you'd recognise it instantly. And it was at a time when, during the Victorian era, that it wasn't popular to paint rough water. The Victorians liked their waters calm and their mountains low. And he painted these very threatening, lurid skies also. They like to think that they were in control of everything, including nature. But nevertheless, Beechey's stuff was very popular among his fellow naval officers and watery people generally. Interesting that he painted a lot of currachs, and that these are shown. Interestingly, that they're coloured brown. And I'm just wondering where they want the ones that were covered in leather originally before tarred canvas came along. And very correctly, you can see there that they carried a little square sail or a lug sail also. He painted quite a good few pictures down around the Blasted Sound and around the Skelligs, what have you. This is a beautiful painting, and I think it kind of points out to the detail which Beechey could put into the depiction of small boats. This is the Roach's Point here. There's a brig on the port tack clawing its way off the shore, and this small lugger about to change tack to go on the port tack also to clear the oncoming brig between the ship and the land. But if you load that up and look at the detail on it, it's very, very detailed all right. And as I said, Beechey, he knew his boats. He knew how to depict them correctly. It's a lovely painting, that. A very, very similar type of painting. That's the Great Arm off Holyhead, and a ship there clawing its way off the shore. Another brig, I think, is it, John? Or it's a little bark, actually, and some wreckage there in the foreground. Another device that Beechey used extensively, which a lot of other artists used, is to show something red in the foreground of the paintings. It was something that was used by Constable and by Turner also. You see a lot of bits of red in the foreground in Beechey's paintings like that. It's just for dramatic effect. Now, when Beechey retired in about 1845 on half pay, that sort of, in a sense, he remained as not an active member, but an inactive member of the Royal Navy. And he got promotion then thereafter by seniority. He was a commander when he retired in 1845. And he moved to Dunleary, or Kingstown as it was then, to a place called Cormac Castle Terrace. Now that's at the top of Northumberland Avenue here. The main street in Dunleary is up here. And he lived in the middle house there on that terrace. Now that terrace is now gone. And there's a terrace of modern houses, relatively modern houses, built in the 1950s across there. And a good friend of mine who's also a talented artist from the Dunleary Historical Society, Colin Scudds, lives in the house that was once occupied Beechey's garden. And part of Beechey's garden wall is in his garden now. Oh. But he was a member of the Royal St. George Yacht Club, and he was in great demand for portraiture of yachts and portraiture generally of vessels. He was sort of upwardly mobile. I've seen figures mentioned of figures in the middle of the 19th century. He was getting about 70 guineas for a fairly large painting, which was a lot of money back then. Smaller ones about 30 guineas, always in guineas. But he moved to number 2 Belgrave Square, that house with the black door there, from Cormac Castle Terrace. And the man that lives there now actually owns 2 of Beechey's paintings, which he acquired. Beechey didn't leave them behind him, but he acquired them, had a lovely painting. I'll show you images of them later on. We're back to this favourite painting of mine now, a Rings End trawler entering Kingstown Harbour. And it has an interesting feature in it, a lot of interesting features, so I'll just go through them all with you. This little boat that's been towed behind it, probably it's generally reckoned to be Admiral Beechey and his friends who went out in this little boat sketching and painting around the coast. And they did have a rig of sail on it. You can see it taken down there. It's the same little boat records. It's like a recording tale, like an artistic leitmotif in a great many of Beechey's paintings. And there's almost always a man in a red coat in the stern, which we reckon probably has to be Beechey himself. Again, a little bit of red in the foreground of the painting. 2 big cutter yachts coming out, flying the Brydges at the Royal St. George Yacht Club, of which Beechey was a member. It's a few interesting features on the battery here. The lighthouse is at a lower level than it is today. That was raised in 1896, raised up about 6 feet. The guns are still on the battery. That great big gun port is no longer there. It's been blocked up, and the bell tower is there. The bell that was in that is now on the battery here, upside down for some reason. Great big ship, the guard ship from Dunleary setting sail. There was more than likely HMS Vanguard, was sunk off Greyhead in 1875 by its sister ship, the Iron Duke. The Iron Duke was coming up hard astern of it in fog. The Vanguard veered to port to get out of the way of a sailing ship, and the Iron Duke ran right into the side of it, and it sank. And it's completely intact, lying on its side, about 10 miles out off Greyhead. And I've dived on it many times. I'm sure John has also. Fabulous dive, huge, absolutely huge Victorian warship. I'll be showing you some more images of the little boat as we go along. But a very, very typical Beechey water there, turbulent water, beautifully depicted, and this sort of threatening sky. More of Beechey's hallmarks. This is several of Beechey's paintings hanging in the Royal St. George Yacht Club. And this is one of them here. Beautiful painting. Unusually now it has calm water in it within the harbour. There's a few interesting features in it. That's the back of the Royal St. George Yacht Club. The little castellated wall is still there. And it's on a regatta day. You can see some of the great big cutter yachts out in the harbour and outside the harbour also. Yachting was very much a rich man's sport back then, throughout the whole of the 19th century. And you can see Beechey in his little boat here. The man with the red jacket is there. The little steamship was probably from the Dunleary or the Kingstown to Dublin Steamship Company that only lasted for a few years in the 1860s before it folded up. There's a lot of interesting features in it. Beechey's human figures are very distinctive. They're almost Lowry-like, always very slim and sometimes slightly hunched over. You'd recognise them straight away. If you look at the picture in the flesh, this yacht over here in the bight of the West Pier is actually flying an American flag. It's an American schooner yacht that came over for the regatta. It was a series of great big regattas used to take place all around Ireland and Britain at the time. That's just a part of the picture blown up. As I say, you can see the rather slim way in which he depicted human figures in that. This painting came up for auction recently by Beechey, and you probably know where it is. It was a viewpoint from Sea Point near the Martello Tower, looking over towards the West Pier in Dunleary. Very unusually calm water. A lot of Beechey's paintings would have been painted to order. So it was most likely, if he was left to his own devices, he probably would have made turbulent water in this. So whoever he was painting it for most likely wanted calm water. And his little boat is here with the man in the red coat. The Salt Hill Hotel is up there. And altogether, beautiful paint. It sold for, I think, 43,000 recently. It's not too long, a few years ago, for auction in Dublin. Beechey painted a great many pictures of yachts. Again, he probably would have done so to order. And that's a fairly typical cutter yacht of the day. And I think that's probably Beechey's little boat there with the sail up. A big schooner yacht here coming up after, coming up hard the stern. And as I say, very, very typical of the yachts of the day. A great many of the fishermen from Ringsend here who crewed on the gaff rig sailing trawlers used to, very much to the annoyance of the skippers and the owners of the sailing trawlers that were here, used to take time off to go as professional crew on these yachts, because it probably would have been much more lucrative going out hauling a net to get a share of the catch. Again, that's a yacht called the Voyage by Lord Colville. Now, I think that's off Portsmouth or Plymouth depicted there. A marvellous big schooner yacht, topsails up, beautiful painting that. Another very, very typical picture of a yacht, except that that's a yawl. It's not a cutter. It has a yawl that is defined by the fact that it has a small mizzenmast, half of the helm usually, with a triangular sail. In fishing boat terms, that would have been called a dandy. They're generally not known as yawls when they have that sort of a rig on them. They're called dandy rig. And another schooner yacht coming up hard there. Same typical beachy sky. This one's called Rounding the Mark. Great big regattas that took place in Dublin Bay generally used one of the local fishing boats as a committee boat normally. And again, there's virtually always something in the foreground of Beechey's paintings like that, a bit of wreckage on a mooring buoy there. The regattas were very popular at the time. They drew huge crowds out along the coast. But the most popular event generally was the sailing trawler race that took place. Because they could crack on, they were wonderful sailors, these guys were professional sailors, and they could sail in very, very heavy winds, very high winds when a lot of the yachts would be going in. Rounding the Mark, this was called. That's a lithograph of a painting that was done by Beechey. I don't know where the original is, and it depicted yachts from the various yacht clubs in Dunleary, and they're all named along the legend on the bottom of the painting there. That particular copy is in the Royal Irish Yacht Club. There's a couple of paintings by him which I'll tell you about now there also, in addition to those in the Royal St. George. Beechey had a very great fondness for painting the mail boats of the day. And there were two lots of mail boats ran between Dunleary, or Kingstown as it was then, and Holyhead. Both of them, both groups of them were named after the provinces, Ulster, Munster, Leinster and Connaught. The very first one, they were paddle wheelers. This is one of them here. And initially they had 4 funnels. Later depictions of them, you'll see they had 2 funnels because they were re-engined in the 1880s. Now this is a picture of the mailboat Ulster off Holyhead. That's the Great Orme over there. A familiar sight to a lot of yachtsmen, I'd imagine. That's the only, one of the few paintings by Beechey. It's the only oil painting that's in the National Gallery here of the mailboat Comet. It's quite a large painting. And I think the only other ones they have are some watercolours of Killaloo. I don't think I would like to be out in that kind of weather in any kind of a vessel. Somehow it might be slightly exaggerated. This picture had quite a history. I don't know which of the mailboats it depicts, but you can see Beechey in his little boat here, standing up. Little boat with wearing his red jacket. This painting was owned by a very nice gentleman called Daniel Gilman, who lived in Dunleary. He was a great collector of Dunleary Kingstown memorabilia. And he was an elderly stockbroker. Before he died, he offered this painting to the Royal St. George of a mailboat entering Kingstown. And the George said, well, we already have a few there, but they didn't want it. So he then offered it to the National Gallery. And they said much the same thing. We have one of those already. So he put it up for auction in Sotheby's in New York, and it made a colossal amount. He was giving it to both the George or the gallery at a very reasonable sum, but it made a figure far in excess of that. One of the stipulations he made was that he get a full-size photographic copy of it, which he got, and that's now hanging in the George. But Daniel was a lovely man. He passed away at a great age. Now, a guy rang me one day, a young man from Wicklow, who told me that he thought there was a Beechey painting in his auntie's wardrobe. So, and would I have a look at it? So he brought it out to Dunleary and we put it up on the railings outside the new library out there and had a good look at it. And I cleaned a little bit of the corner here where Beechey normally signed his paintings, and I found the last four letters of his name, and sure enough, and I found the last four letters on the transom, on the stern rather, of the thing, STER. So it's one of the quartet provinces, Ulster, Leinster or Munster. But you can see there that it's very, very black. What will normally be depicted as very turbulent water is black. And there are holes in it. Somebody must be firing a dart gun at it or something like that. And it's in generally very, very dirty and decrepit condition. How anybody could let such a valuable painting get into that condition, I simply don't know. It depicts one of the mailboats entering Holyhead. That's the mall on the end of the breakwater in Holyhead. Great big long breakwater there. Now, I think the reason why this is so black here, at a certain time in the 19th century, a pigment came online that contained bitumen, and it was used extensively by artists because they were able to get great effects of shading with it. But subsequently, that pigment migrated into all of the other pigments and killed it, and I think that's what's happened here. And it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to redress, to reverse. I think that's what happened there. Next one. It was hanging in the Royal Irish Yacht Club. There's a very, very similar painting, which might have been one of a pair. It's exactly the same size as that other one. Incidentally, I offered to clean and repair that painting, and I haven't heard from the young man since. He said he's gone overboard with his auntie, so it's probably gone back into the wardrobe. But this painting is hanging in the Royal Irish Yacht Club, and it's very, very similar to the other one. It shows one of the mailboats, which has four funnels in this one, entering Kingstown Harbour, about to enter Kingstown in very turbulent weather. But that has suffered a similar fate with whatever got into the paint down in the lower part was there and then part of the sky. So I reckon it was probably painted around much the same time. I'm sure the effect took place fairly quickly, and they discontinued using this bitumen paint, or paint that contained bitumen at any rate. But this has been greatly mucked around with, cleaned and restored, and it's really not in great condition. It's one of, I think there are three altogether in the Royal Irish. This painting here, I think there are two paintings by Richard Brydges Beechey in Castle out in Skerries. I think of the name of it now in a minute. It's owned by the County Council. Ardgillan, that's it, yeah. Now, there are two paintings by Beechey out there hanging on either side of a chimney breast. I think this is one of them. Depicts again one of the mailboats leaving Kingstown Harbour. They were both owned by Joe McGrath, the man who famously started the sweepstake and who started the glass bottle company up here in Ringsend. Also, when his house was sold off, his effects were sold off, and the County Council bought the two paintings. this one here, again, more than likely, this is one of them. This is one on the far side of the chimney. I haven't seen these. A friend of mine photographed them for me. But this painting by Beechey was more than likely painted to order by somebody, and it has a literary connection. It depicts the young girl that was drowned in Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, The Wreck of the Hesperus. And you can see the Hesperus was a schooner that was wrecked on a reef off the east coast of America called Norman's Woe. You can see it over here in the distance, and her body was found tied to the mast the next day with hunters on the shore. A very popular poem. I think this is a little bit out of another one I want to go on, but that's just another fairly typical Beechey painting down around the glass that's down on the skellies and what have you, and some small, but more than likely the soundings that they would have been doing, taking soundings off the bottom, would have been done from a small boat like this, but by a man swinging a lead. The lead was in great use back then, sounding lead. Yeah, now this painting by Beechey here has another literary connection and a Dublin connection also, because it depicts the blowing up of the warship L'Orient at the Battle of the Nile, when Nelson's fleet got the drop on the French fleet at the Battle of Aboukir Bay, and the French warship L'Orient, they were all at anchor having wine, and Nelson sailed in on them and blew them all to bits. And the great French warship L'Orient blew up. And it was the subject of a famous poem by this lady here, Dorothea Felicia Hemans, also known as Mrs. Hemans, who lived in Dawson Street in Dublin. And it's a much parodied poem that you probably all have heard. The boy stood on the burning deck. That's what that's all about. It's about this event here. The name of the poem is actually Casabianca. It was the captain's name. Mrs. Hemans is actually buried in St. Anne's Church in Dawson Street, near where she lived. Now, Beechey painted a couple of paintings to do with the Spanish Armada. This one is in an institute in Plymouth, and it depicts what was actually one of the great crossroads of history, one of the great turning points in European history. As if this event that it depicts here hadn't taken place, we might all be speaking Spanish today in this part of the world. Because when the Spanish fleet came to anchor out off Calais, the English very sneakily sent fire ships in among them. And there was a general panic when all of the Spanish vessels had to slip their anchors. And with the mounting gales coming, they couldn't head back up the channel. So they had to literally abandon the effort at that stage. They sailed up the North Sea and around the north of Scotland and headed home to Spain. It was a dreaded tactic during naval warfare. I think Beechey painted a couple of paintings depicting this event, and as far as I know, one of them was destroyed in the Blitz in an institute in Plymouth. I think that's it there. I'm not too sure about that, but it depicts the same event. Everything aboard ships back then was inflammable, and if a vessel like that came near you, everything would burn. There's lots of tar and oil and canvas, wood. That's a very fine picture of pilot vessels. It's called First Come, First Served, depicting Bristol Channel or English Channel pilot cutters. It was a competitive business. There were great cutter-rigged vessels, something like the one Adrian Spence owned up to quite recently. But it was a competitive business, and you can see there's two vessels there heading out to get a line aboard the ship there that's lying with the sails aback. And whoever got the line aboard first got the job of piloting the vessel into port. Beautiful picture of that. Beechey and a great several other marine artists that I'll tell you about in a little while were very fond of painting these vessels here, which were moored all along here during the whole of the 19th century. The fleet of Ringsend sailing trawlers. I've recently written a book about them. That painting there depicts some of them. Now, they're not sailing, they're actually at anchor with the sails up drying. That picture was taken from this very spot that we're at here, looking out towards, that's the mouth of the Alexandra Basin there, the lighthouse. And Beechey and several other artists that I mentioned, marine artists in Dublin, were very fond of painting. Now, I've read lists of the paintings that Beechey exhibited at the Royal Hibernian Academy, and a great many of them have to do with this subject matter here. Now, it's unfortunate that we can't see very many of them today because most of them would be in private possession. But that's a fairly typical one that he painted. That's called a River's End sailing trawler leaving port. And again, if you look at it there, there's great detail of all of the rigging. If you want to know how to rig a gaff rigged, cutter rigged vessel, you have to look no further than that. All of the rigging up here, the peak halyard and the throat halyard. And very, very interestingly, we practically all sail with the tack of the mainsail thrice up like that. I'm not altogether sure why, but all of the depictions, paintings and photographs of them show that feature there. And the sail is reefed. Now, it's reefed onto itself, unusually, and not reefed at the boom, which you'd normally expect it to be. So it's just an interesting feature. And there are lots of them on all of Beechey's paintings of small boats. That's another one there. Very, very similar. That's also called the River's End sailing trawler leaving port. At least that's what it was called in the auction at any. Both of those made very, very substantial prices recently. This is a painting now that Beechey would have painted to order for that gentleman I mentioned, Captain Cater, who subsequently became the master of the Royal Yacht Victoria and Albert. I've come across about 8 different paintings of different vessels that were done for Captain Cater by Beechey. So we clearly wanted to have a visual painted record of the vessels that he was on. And this depicts a Portuguese slave ship being attacked by a couple of parties on small boats from HMS Philomel, which is anchored over here somewhere. One of the things that the Royal Navy did during the 19th century was to work in the suppression of the slave trade, because long after the American Civil War, slavery was still in vogue in Brazil. I think it was right up to 1886 before it was finally abolished. And this depicts a very fast Brazilian brigantine, very fast-looking vessel with the Brazilian flag hanging down, and a lot of people in a small boat here, more than likely slaves, about to be loaded on board, and the party on board are firing at the oncoming Royal Naval personnel. This was painted for Captain Cater, so he was obviously at that action and ordered the painting from Beechey. This is very much painted in the style of some of the continental painters, such as Dutch painters like the Van der Velde family. And it depicts a typical Dutch sailing vessel with blunt bows and lee boards there. Now, I don't know whether Beechey ever painted. A lot of the marine artists from here and in Britain painted on the North Sea coast of Europe. Very great many of them that I could mention. Now, I don't know whether Beechey ever did that, but it's a very, very typical Dutch scene, I would imagine, as I said, very much in the style of the Van der Veldes. Again, more than likely a painting that was painted to order for somebody who had taken part in the Battle of Trafalgar. The French warship Aquile, on fire and about to sink, and a British warship coming up hard on the port tack, about to lay another broadside into her, probably the warship down. And there's a lot of people clinging to wreckage here in the foreground. Very, very dramatic painting that.
The Battle of Trafalgar was in a flat calm.
Yeah, well, I mean, a bit of artistic license on us didn't go straight back then, you know. Again, this was another vessel that took part in the battle, HMS Britannia. Again, probably more than likely painted to order for some sea captain, despite the calm weather. He decided to add a touch here and there, I imagine. You can see there that the mizzen mast has been shot away, and a lot of wreckage in the foreground. I don't know what wreck that is, but it's very dramatic painting. There's a vessel coming up hard in very stormy weather, big lurid sky, very turbulent water, and people clinging to the rigging, and more people in the water there. It more than likely depicted the wreck as some known shipwreck, but what exactly one it is, I don't know. He was very fond of painting shipwrecks also, I might add. That's a painting that's now in New Zealand, in a place called Waitakere. And that wreck was HMS Orpheus. It's the worst shipwreck that occurred in the Royal Navy in the 19th century. And a great many Royal Naval personnel were lost when the ship ran up on a reef. And it's in the office of the Mayor of Waitakere, Mayor Harvey, who sent me this image. I probably painted by somebody who to order for somebody who survived the wreck. But I don't think Beechey actually served down in that part of the world. Well, a very dramatic picture, nevertheless. Mayor Harvey also discovered the whereabouts of the grave of a man called Daniel Pullen, whose father was the dockmaster up here in the canal basin, and he had it restored recently. Daniel Pullen was born in Ringsend, was a doctor, and he went on to become the Premier of New Zealand. It's just an interesting thing about Mayor Harvey. I had a great correspondence with him. Again, another shipwreck. I would love to know the names of these because I don't think there were notional shipwrecks. There were something he would have been painting of a particular vessel being wrecked, and I don't recognise where that lighthouse is or that headland is. But it's a very, very dramatic picture of a lifeboat having rescued the crew of that vessel there. As I say, I'd love to know where exactly it's supposed to be. Beechey painted quite a good few landscapes, and not really enough. He was a wonderful landscape painter. Now, they were generally of maritime associated areas. That's, I think, the Connor Pass down in Kerry, and it's called Bringing Home the Turf. A man trudging along a coastal path there, the cliffs, big towering cliffs and mountains there, and a horse and cart with a red wheel on it, and much in the style of Constable. Yeah, he painted quite a good few pictures in Killarney. He seemed to be really fond of that. He seemed to have brought a small boat with him, whoever he managed that to get his boat up into the lakes of Killarney, because it's depicted in that picture there, the upper lake in Killarney. I'm sure you'll agree it's a magnificent picture. And as I say, he didn't really do an awful lot of landscapes, mostly marine paintings. Glenbeigh on the Barda Peninsula, I've been down there and it's a beautiful place. But that's a magnificent painting. You can see a little bit of red here in the foreground. He generally, in some of these rustic scenes, he generally had an Irish colleen wearing a red cloak or something like that. And Muckross Lake, again, I don't see his little boat. He didn't leave his little boat along there. A beautiful, beautiful landscape. And very, very unusually, he hasn't got this big, threatening, lowering sky up there. Nice day. Sleigh Head, looking out at the blasted sound, and a couple of colleens here with a few panniers of turf, more than likely, being chatted up by a traveller there, and the colleen wearing a red cloak, and her companion there waiting patiently till she's finished being chatted up. Lovely painting. Now, if anybody has any notion where this is by Beechey, and it depicts a waterfall with a bridge over it, and this little boat is in it, a lady in a red dress. Nobody seems to know where it is. I thought it may have been in Killarney. I've spoken to a lot of people who know Killarney very intimately, the park down south in Killarney, and they say it's definitely not there. I've spoken to people who know various places in Wales, and nobody seems to know where it is. I can't bring myself to believe that it's a notional thing. It certainly looks like an Irish scene, or certainly a British scene at any rate. And it may have been, I thought perhaps it might have been Switzerland or somewhere, but nobody seems to know where it is. But it's a fantastic painting, I'm sure you'd agree. Beechey moved to 110 Pembroke Road. His first wife died about 1885, and he moved to 110 Pembroke Road. Now, I'm told he moved there to be near Bagot Street Hospital. I don't know how true that is. I came across that bit of information somewhere. But he moved back to Plymouth shortly after that. He married again, and he and his new wife moved to Plymouth. But he continued painting nevertheless. And he seems to have brought, was painted while he was back living in Plymouth, and he seems to have brought a little boat with him. That's the Needles off the Isle of Wight. I'm sure many of you have seen that while sailing. That's a part of the world I'm very familiar with myself. It's the Grand Harbour in Malta on a very, very wild, turbulent day. It wouldn't get like that in the harbour today because there's now a great big breakwater built across the mouth of the harbour there that you have to come in around. But you can see there that everybody's scrambling to get this vessel tidied down, and general chaos reigning. Some of the forts that are around the harbour. An extremely interesting place, literally dripping with history. If you ever get a chance to go there, wonderful place, Malta. That's in Valletta. A very, very similar painting of Plymouth on a very turbulent day. And I think I love the way that man is depicted there, leaning into the wind, almost Lowry-like figure again. And a lot of wreckage around, and a boat being rounding on the wall here. That's Plymouth Hall over here. That's the old Eddystone lighthouse that was taken down and placed up on the hull there. That's a very similar scene on a calm day, and it depicts a ship being paid off and the naval personnel coming ashore being greeted by the Lowths. Probably HMS Blossom, although I couldn't find out the title of it. It's a very, very fine picture. Unusually a lot of human figures in it. He liked painting the Eddystone lighthouses, and it's very unusual to see a painting of the two lighthouses when they were there. That was the original one, and that's the new one that's there today. That one was taken down and re-erected in Plymouth, and a fairly typical sailing cutter. You can see there the tack of the sail triced up. Always and ever, those type of vessels sail that way. Probably for visibility when sailing in close waters, like the port here. I'm not sure. Another vessel showing the two lighthouses. Beechey had a very distinctive and diagnostic way of painting boards also. You'll see a lot of them in his paintings. Boards taking flight. A steamship over there in the distance, a steam warship. Beechey died in 1895. His brother, after he retired in the 1840s, went on to become a member of the Arctic Council. He was an admiral by then. That was an advisory body got up to advise the Navy on Arctic exploration. And all of the great Arctic explorers are in this, including Franklin here. This is Franklin. But you know, he was subsequently lost on his quest to find the Northwest Passage. That's a picture of him there. He died in 1865. This is Frederick William now, the older brother. But he carried out a great maritime survey of all the ports in Ireland to advise the Navy. And one of the things that he recommended was that Galway be developed as a very big deep water ocean port for the transatlantic liner trade. Of course, it was never acted upon. He made all sorts of recommendations like that. That's his daughter there, Frances Ann Hopkins, who was also a famous artist. As I say, art ran through this family like a thread. She was married to the supervisor of the Hudson's Bay Company in Canada, Frances Ann Hopkins, and she painted a great deal whilst over there. His job was to go around all of this, the waterways, the rivers and the lakes up in Canada, inspecting the Hudson's Bay outposts. There were traders mostly in furs, stuff like that, and they travelled by these great big birch bark canoes. And Frances Ann Hopkins painted a whole series of these, which have become very iconic in Canada. They're in various museums and art galleries, and they're greatly revered. This is depicting the canoe that they travel around and shooting the rapids. It's probably the Lachine Rapids on the St. Lawrence River, which I've seen a couple of times. And you can see Frances Ann and her husband here in the middle of the canoe and all the guys paddling away. This is called Voyages. There's a lot of French connection in that part of the world. That's another one there. That was featured on a stamp in Canada recently, another one of Frances Ann Hopkins' paintings. I'm sure you'd agree, wonderful painting. Some Native Americans there also in that. And that's a picture by her of a Native American Indian canoe shooting the rapids. Absolutely beautiful picture. Apparently she wasn't averse to roughing it with her husband. She slept under the birch bark canoe. At night time when they were travelling around, they'd haul up the canoe and make a tent out of it. And she regularly slept on the ground under the canoe. That's the stamp that was brought out in recent times, commemorating Frances Ann Hopkins. She returned to England in her latter days and died there. Richard Brydges Beechey's daughter was famous also. She was an artist in her own right, but she was famous for another reason. This is Freed's wife, Frances Beechey. She was known as Fanny Beechey. and she was a famous chess champion. She wrote books about chess problems, and they're still in print today. 2 books she wrote, and they're regarded as the definitive books on chess problems. She lived in Clontarf, first of all. She had lived in Galway and she could speak Irish. She obviously learned Irish probably in the Claddagh, and there was a lot of Irish spoken. And she published a small newspaper in Dunleary at one stage, which had a large Irish content in it. She wound up her days living in Bray. She was married to another chess champion called Thomas Rowland, who was a journalist, and they syndicated a chess column in various newspapers throughout the world. These are the 2 books that she wrote, original copies, but they're still in print. She wrote one of them under the name of Beechey and the other under the name of Rowland, Chess Blossoms and Chess Fruits. These are 3 other marine artists that I'm very fond of. I regard the 3 of these and Admiral Beechey, I call them the 4 evangelists of maritime art in Dublin Bay. Alexander Williams, Matthew Kendrick and Edwin Hayes. Now, all 3 of these are wonderful marine artists. They all lived in Dublin and they all would have known Admiral Beechey. They all knew each other. They were all members of the Royal Hibernian Academy. Now, unusually, Beechey was regarded as an amateur painter, which seems a nonsense because it was just an appellation given to people who had another profession. And he was a naval officer up to the day that he died. So he couldn't be made a full member of the Royal Hibernian Academy. He's an associate member. It was just that little bit of distinction at the time. You had to be a full-time professional artist with no other profession to be accorded that distinction. But they all had another thing in common. They all lived to be a great age, and their lives sort of ran in parallel to each other. Williams is more noted for his landscapes, but he was nevertheless a wonderful marine artist, and he had a great fondness for Ringsend and all of the sailing trawlers and other fishing vessels that were around the bay. And I've read lists of all of the paintings that these have done, and they all mention, you'd love to see them all in the one place. But as I say, they're all practically all owned in private collections. There's only one by Edwin Hayes in the National Gallery, which depicts a passenger ship just moored over there at the far side of the river. Matthew Kendrick was the keeper of paintings in the Royal Hibernian Academy. And there are very, very few of his paintings visible yet. I've seen this of paintings that he exhibited, and a huge amount of paintings at Dublin Bay, all 3 of them. Before he died, Richard Brydges Beechey became a great favourite of Queen Victoria. That's the painting that he did of the Royal Yacht, Victoria and Albert, approaching the Isle of Wight, and that's Osborne House. Sorry, it's not the Victoria and Albert. She had 2 Royal Yachts, the Victoria and Albert and one called the Osborne, named after the house over there, Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. So this is the last slide you'll be glad to hear, and this is the painting that I unearthed in the bowels of the National Library, as I said. It was in his obituary in this painting called a Lustrograph. It was published in Dunleary in the 1890s. And it's the only painting that I've ever seen of him. He was promoted by seniority and he wound up his days as a Rear Admiral. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cormac. What an excellent start to our winter series. And I think we'll throw the floor open out to questions. Any questions asked?
I wonder if the unidentified picture of that waterfall isn't in fact Pool of Foucault before the dam was built.
No, definitely not. No, the bridge is only just in Pool of Foucault. It's a single arch bridge, and the waterfall was underneath it, and it's only a trickle today. It was quite a considerable waterfall, but it's very, very distinctive. You'd know it straight away. But there are actual photographs of it, and I've seen a few paintings of it also before the dam was built. Yeah. That was only built in the 1930s.
Well, you mentioned moving lighthouses.
Yeah.
And there was one Brydges Point lighthouse, which was in one of the earlier pictures you put.
Yeah.
And they built a grander lighthouse there and dismantled that one, and that is now this leading lights going up Waterford Harbour.
I wasn't aware of that. I'm delighted to get that bit of information. Thank you.
The front light is on Callan Ford. And the rear light It's not behind.
So was it reassembled in its entirety in Waterford Harbour? The Roach's Point lighthouse that was taken down, was it reassembled?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the real light. And it's now in private ownership. I think it's the only lighthouse in Ireland that's privately run.
Well,
the two of them were shut down. They both seem to be.
That's very interesting. It so happens that one of our next lecturers is going to be Andrew Doherty, who's giving us a talk about Waterford Harbour. So I'll have to quiz him before he comes on to find out, does he know that bit of information. It's very interesting to see the way the lighthouses were made back then. A lot of the blocks were dovetailed together, all chopped out by hand. I was looking at a brochure about the building of the Fastnet. Fascinating.
The Essex and Dún Laoghaire, was that after his time, you know, or the Essex?
Well, no, the Essex was there in the very beginning of the opening of when Dún Laoghaire Harbour was built in the 1820s. It didn't last for much longer after that. I think it lasted for about 10 years. It was a former American frigate that had been captured down off South America and was subsumed into the Royal Navy. And it was subsequently then used as a detention ship for people awaiting transportation to Australia. And in actual fact, a friend of mine has prepared a paper on it, and he'd be giving it, or has given it, I'm not sure which, out in the Yacht Club in Dún Laoghaire, Tom Conlon.
They found the tunnel from the town.
Pardon?
They found the tunnel when they were digging down there, putting into a walk tunnel underground to go to the ship.
Well, I would doubt that very much, because I can tell you this much: there are more stories about tunnels all around Ireland. The tunnel from here to there and everything else would have been a very difficult job tunneling out to a ship anyway. So I don't want to burst your bubble, but there are stories of tunnels going from the convent in Dalkey out to Dalkey Island and the Dublin and all. One from Bellegarde Castle, near where I live, down to Walkinstown and a whole lot of things like that. But it's interesting that the Essex, a man who became very famous during the American Civil War, was the cabin boy on it when it was captured by the British Admiral Farragut, the man who famously said, "Damn the torpedoes," when he sailed up the Mississippi to break through the blockade.
There's a painting of Ringsend from Beggar's Bush that looks very much in the style of Beechey. Do you know? Is that?
I know the one in question. I don't think it's by any of those artists there. It's a watercolour sketch, and you can see various features on it, like the conical shaped chimneys. I think one of them was a lead smelter, and there are various other interesting features on it if you study it very closely. I don't know who the actual artist was with that particular one. Are we done?
Just one other thing that caught my eye.
Sorry.
When you listed the ships he served in, and there was one in 1831, HMS, I pronounce it Curacao, but in that it was spelled with an A over the end.
Did I show a picture of it?
What?
Did I?
No, you had a list of.
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. Yeah, the list of vessels that Beechey served in, yeah. Curacao. That's a place somewhere in Central America, I believe. Yeah. Did I have it spelled wrongly? No?
People would say it was spelled, you spelled it right, but from a later ship with the same name, it was actually spelled the old way.
Was it really? Yeah.
So,
well, there's a liqueur called after it called Blue Curacao, and I know people that call it, I'll have a Blue Caraco.
the later ship could give you another theme for a lecture for another night.
Yeah,
Because she was run down by the Queen Mary north of Tory Island.
Really? Oh, really? I didn't know that, yeah. Well, in actual fact, another of our lecturers that's going to be speaking to us, Stewie Andrews, has dived extensively up around there on very deep wrecks on the northern approaches, and the visibility on some of the wrecks that he's dived on is absolutely colossal. And he's brought back some fantastic photographs and footage, so I'm sure Stewie will know all about that. I'm sure you'll come along to his lecture also.
Yes.
He knew
Just to say thank you to everybody for this evening.